May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning. I must say that it is indeed a great privilege to be with you this morning. I am extremely grateful for the invitation from Father Phil and Father Mike, who have been great supporters of the work of Episcopal Charities, and I'm just grateful for them inviting me to say a few words to you all this morning. You know, in the spirit of MLK, for the time that is ours to share together this morning, I'd love to preach from this sermonic theme, a time to break silence. It's drawn from a very small portion of our first reading this morning, found in that third chapter of Exodus, really verses 9 and 10, and I'd love to read those into our hearing just once again. And it reads as thus: "The cry of the Israelites has come to me. I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Other versions say, "Now go, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." You know, from time to time in each of our lives, God issues an invitation to do what is difficult and stir up some good trouble. On April 4th, 1967, Martin King delivered perhaps the most consequential speech of his entire life. It was here in New York City on a fateful Tuesday evening where, compelled by his own convictions, King decided that it was time to break his silence on the perpetuation of what he called the three evils in American society, which were racism, excessive materialism, and extreme militarism. As a result, King's speech made him the first minister with a national stage to publicly speak out against the United States' involvement in the war at Vietnam. As a preacher steeped in this prophetic tradition, King knew what it meant to be called to act in ways that could potentially be viewed unfavorably by those who had acquired significant social power and control of politics. Historians claim that as a result of his actions, the following day, 168 American newspapers denounced him for delivering the speech, and President Lyndon B. Johnson even disinvited him to the White House because of his bold stance on the war and other U.S. policies. In a real sense, this was King's cost of discipleship, and he was being forced to pay a steep price. The next 12 months of King's life would be plagued by vicious assaults on his character and even dismissal by the country's black middle class and militants. Those closest to him said that those 12 months were the loneliest year of his life. Perhaps not so coincidentally, exactly 1 year to the date after delivering that speech, on April 4th, 1968, King would be gunned down while standing on the balcony at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. One might ask, why did he do it? Why take the risk? Why do the hard thing? If I'm allowed to use my sanctified imagination, I'd imagine that knowing that there would be consequences for his actions, King must have come to the realization that there is this dichotomy within the Christian faith between being comfortable and being called. Follow me, if you will, to the backside of Midian, and there we meet a prophet named Moses. He's comfortable. And yet one day God appears to him in a burning bush, and he calls him to a new work that will come at a great price. God invites Moses to an opportunity to stir up some good trouble. The opening verses of the book of Exodus tell us that things began to change in Egypt when there came a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph or what he had done. A Pharaoh who knew not Joseph or what he had done? How in the world could any Pharaoh not know Joseph? How could Pharaoh not have known what Joseph did to save Egypt from the 7 years of famine? How could Pharaoh not have known how Joseph expertly served as governor during a pivotal time in Egypt's history? How could Pharaoh not have known the significant contributions of Joseph and his kinsmen who helped build Egypt into the great nation that it had become? How could Pharaoh not know Joseph? Perhaps this Pharaoh grew up in a nation that banned certain textbooks that highlighted the contributions of ethnic minorities in their society. Perhaps this Pharaoh was shielded from ever having any meaningful conversations about the systemic mistreatment of those who did not look like him. Perhaps this Pharaoh was so blinded by his own greed and self-interest and paid no attention to how various discriminatory policies were impacting others. And before we know it, the descendants of Joseph and all the children of Israel have served 400 years in bondage. That's where we find Moses in this text. Frustrated by the many social injustices of his day, Moses, exhausted from maintaining this hyphenated reality as an Israelite who was raised in Egyptian culture, Moses, who despite having privilege of his own, longed for the opportunity to use his privilege to help free someone else. Moses, a well-intentioned freedom fighter, whose worst mistake led to a guilty conviction on murder charges. Moses now has a warrant in Egypt and becomes a fugitive in Midian. He's now tending sheep for his father-in-law Jethro when one day on the backside of a mountain he sees a bush on fire. And from that bush he hears the voice of God who says, among other things, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." I can almost hear God asking Moses rhetorically, how long will the children of Israel be given the unrealistic expectation of achieving a certain standard without ever having access to the resources that are needed in order to be successful? Bricks without straw. How long will the Israelites be subjected to degraded work environments despite their employers knowing what it's doing to their health? How long will my people continue to build things that they'll eventually be denied access to? Moses, come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. You know, we often highlight Moses' hesitation when he asks the question, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? We often highlight the excuses that Moses makes to God. But I can certainly understand why he's so reluctant. The fight will not be easy. Justice will not come immediately. Freedom will certainly cost something. For we know this even from G.K. Chesterton, who reminds us that the true soldier fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but rather because he loves what is behind him. He says no hero marches into battle merely to destroy for the sake of destroying. Instead, they march into battle for the sake of conserving. And we know that in that day, there were plenty of things worth conserving in ancient Egypt. There in Egypt, its leadership boasted the greatest political and military power throughout the world. There in Egypt, its citizens enjoyed the most robust economy that the world had ever known. There in Egypt, people had reasonable access to the finest goods from around the globe. How dare Moses pick a fight with someone who had so much to lose? Moses hears God's command and knows that he's in for a challenge. After all, in Egypt, they had many gods by many names. We know something about that, don't we? Many gods by many names. This is not necessarily a theological critique, but rather a recognition of the things that we often worship. We see the gods of racism and white supremacy worshiped not just when specific grocery stores and Bible studies are targeted by gunmen, but also in the countless microaggressions that people are forced to endure in boardrooms and classrooms every single day. We see the gods of heteronormativity, homophobia, and transphobia worshipped when innocent people are brutally attacked on the street for no good reason. We see the dual-headed gods of gun care and health control worshipped when legislation is passed that declares that some people's rights are more important than others. We see the gods of ageism and ableism, the gods of classism and sexism, the gods of religious oppression, youth oppression, elder oppression, and this is only compounded by the illusion that there is a zero-sum game. And yet, we still hear the voice of God saying, "Deliver my people from this injustice." In speaking to Moses, in delivering the Israelites out of the hands of Pharaoh and out of the land of Egypt, God was calling forth a new nation that could only begin when someone had the courage to confront the powers that be. God was establishing a new thing, and the person that God chose to speak through did not have to be perfect, but simply willing to follow the voice of God. Come and speak to Pharaoh. Perhaps that's the invitation that God is extending to us today. Come and speak to Pharaoh. Now, we may not have an absolute ruler like ancient Egypt, but we certainly have powers and systems and structures that work to maintain the status quo. And perhaps God is calling us today to speak to those powers, systems, and structures until we can dream of a world, a new nation where God, all of God's children can flourish together. God is calling us to speak to the prison industrial complex until we can imagine a new nation where millions of justice-involved Americans are no longer defined by their worst mistakes, and a criminal record no longer means a lifetime of blocked opportunities. God is calling us to speak to our obsession with guns, until we can imagine a new nation where everyone is able to go to church, school, the grocery store, or the hospital without fear of being attacked. God is calling us to speak to poverty until we can imagine a new nation where every child has a safe place to learn and grow, and every family has access to a decent meal. Perhaps God is calling us to speak to patriarchy, to speak to privilege, to speak to inequality, to speak to every ism and every phobia, to speak until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness an ever-flowing stream. But we must not be disillusioned. For we know that breaking silence always comes at a price. But as God did for Moses in this morning's first reading, God also does for us. When facing our own fears for the sake of someone else, God gives us the only promise we'll ever need: I will be with you. This is good news. For whenever the great I Am says, I will, we know that those are promises that we can trust. Therefore, when the time comes, we can show up for the challenge and act in faith, for we know that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Therefore, my prayer is that we leave this place with a newfound faith, a faith that sees the invisible, a faith that expects the incredible, a faith that receives the impossible, a faith to reach the unreachable, a faith to fight the unbeatable, a faith to remove the unmovable, a faith that withstands the inevitable, a faith that can surely conquer anything. Amen.